Hello and welcome. I'm Alex. This is Evan. And today we're going to be talking about under what circumstances it is suitable to murder your mother. We're going to be talking about the second play in the trilogy Oresteia by Aeschylus. About a month ago, we looked into Agamemnon. And today we're going to be reading the Libation Bearers. We're discussing it.
Do you want to start, Alex? I think we did this last time. I think it's helpful. Do you want to summarize briefly the sort of action in this play before I have some questions we can get to afterwards, but I think it's a helpful setup.
To get oriented. Well, and I was also thinking about how much of the first play we should go over. I mean, the best thing is if somebody's interested in the second play, hopefully you've already read the first one and maybe you've already watched our first episode about that. But if you haven't, I definitely recommend you do that. But just briefly, the first play basically centers on the murder of the king Agamemnon by his wife Clytemnestra. And that takes a while to happen. And now in the second play, in the Libation Bearers, it seems that a few years have passed. It's not totally clear, but some amount of time has passed. And it begins with Clytemnestra's two children. First, Orestes, her son, shows up, and then he makes contact with her daughter, Electra, and they talk for a while. And they eventually Orestes he goes to the palace to murder Aeschylus, who is Clytemnestra's new husband, her lover, and also Clytemnestra. And it takes a while for all that to unfold, but that's the center of it.
One thing I thought might be interesting to start with, though, maybe we'll have to come back to it later. One question that came up in a lot of the secondary sources, and that I found myself interested in, is why this play is called The Libation Bearers. Obviously, there's a plot point that you just brought up, which is that at the beginning, the libation bearers, who are actually slaves from the Trojan War, female slaves, and they're bringing libations to the grave of Agamemnon. I think it's either implied or said explicitly to sort of sate his angry soul, because Clytemnestra is sort of worried about if the ghost or the spirit of Agamemnon will exact vengeance in some way. And so these slaves have been sent to bring libations to the grave, but then they become a force that's encouraging Orestes to kill his mother and her lover. And also I think they participate in some way. They call the nurse, or they play like a small role in executing the conspiracy. And so everyone, I guess I'm not as good a reader as I used to be. This didn't jump out to me at first, but a lot of the discussion I saw about this book was sort of how interesting it is that, especially in the title, these secondary characters and characters that you would imagine would be, extremely low status in this situation, they're given the title. I mean, this particular story, I think, is also written by, there's a rendition of it by Euripides and one of the other tragedians, and those are both called Electra, Orestes' sister, like sort of a normal, one of the major players.
Yeah, one of the characters.
Electra is very minor in this rendering. That's another interesting thing that people talk about, the sort of extent to which Electra is off stage after the initial setup. But do you have thoughts on why this is called The Libation Bearers and what it sort of means for this play to have its chorus of slaves occupy the title?
I do have some thoughts about that. My thought about it was not that it was focused on libation, on these slaves, on the chorus. And I didn't read any scholarly commentary on this, so that's probably closer to the mark. But I took a sort of broader view of why it had that title, but I was still taking the idea that the title should have, it's probably about the main characters, because I was thinking that, well, who are the libation bearers? On the one hand, you have Orestes showing up and putting some hair on cuts off a lock of his hair and puts that on the grave. And then Electra pours, somebody brings one of the libations, or she takes from them or something that's not really detailed. And then she pours it, or it talks about pouring it. And then there's a third thing, which is that Clytemnestra actually sent that libation through them. I think that's what was going on there. We can talk about that. And so I went, well, all these people are in some sense libation bearers. They're not physically, they're not the ones whose task it is, whose social position is that they're the ones who carry it, but they are sending these libations to the grave, and for different reasons. But that's probably, what do you call that? Not anachronistic, but that's probably just like me not understanding that this was like a servant position to be the libation bearer, and that was, and for some reason Aeschylus titled the play that.
I think you're totally right. Like, if the definition of the libation bearer is someone who completes a ritual to quell the souls of the dead, then Clytemnestra is a libation bearer, Orestes is a libation bearer, Electra is a libation bearer. So you're totally right that it could be sort of like a clever title that, upon first glance, and again, this is hard because we don't know, or I don't know.
No, I certainly don't.
In the original Greek, how suggestive the word would be of, is it the type of word that you would, in the connotation of the language, would it be like a sort of fixed connotation word where you'd think it applies only to these slaves who make up the chorus, or is it the kind of word that lends itself to saying, no, this represents more a role, and yes, imagining Orestes or Clytemnestra being described this way. I really like that. Some of the stuff I read, and I think it's a good yin and yang having me explore some of this secondary stuff and you sort of come in fresh, because I would not have thought of that interpretation, and I didn't hear it in the secondary stuff that I delved into, but that's really interesting. And the thought that I had that I sort of liked was, again, talking about the modern qualities of Aeschylus, is like, I was wondering to myself, when I got into literature, when you'd read books as a kid, old books, the books are called like Tom Sawyer. What's Tom Sawyer about? It's about Tom Sawyer.
It's about Tom Sawyer, yeah.
And like, there were no like clever titles. Like the title was very utilitarian. And so in my mind, it was something I associated with modern and postmodern literature, that you give a book like a winky title, and that's supposed to give the reader some sense of like, it's almost like a way of giving the game away. It's like, when you read this book, you might think it's about so-and-so, but what I'm telling you by naming the title, not after the titular character, not after the main character or the main place, I'm suggesting that this other aspect of the plot is very important. Like, to me, that's like a modern convention. I'm trying to think of, I don't know if you have on the top of your head, but this is the thing that happens a lot now, right? Like, people will not name their novels like, oh, this novel's about Jeff Smith, so I'm naming it Jeff Smith. They'll give it some clever or obscure title so that it draws you. And I almost wondered, like, is this the first example in literature of someone doing sort of a subtle and suggestive title?
Yeah, I do think that that's an innovation related to modern book publishing. Is at some point they figured out that if you put in a title that like kind of asks a question or it kind of hooks in some way, then you're going to have a book that sells a little bit better than if it's just called Tom Sawyer or like The Odyssey, and which a story about Odysseus. And I do think that's a modern thing, and I wonder, well, it maybe went to a different level sometime in the last 100 years or so, where you have a title of a book and it's totally unrelated to the main character, or it's somehow, it asks a question that you want to answer, or it's attractive in some way. Even if you just heard the title, if your friend, you didn't see the cover or anything, you just heard the title of the book, it would make you want to go and check out that book. Yeah, that seems like it would be a modern thing. For example, I kind of wonder, would Aeschylus's audience have even known the title of the play? I'm kind of, presumably he wrote it down somewhere, but I don't know if there were posters. There probably weren't posters, but was there a program written, or was it just like, oh, now we're going to do the next play?
Right.
Like a title is something that you use to kind of package something and move it around in a media environment. What's the movie called? It's called
Right,
this.
or did he choose that title, or is that how we refer to it?
Yeah, did he choose that title? I mean, I sort of assume he did, but that would change it a lot if somebody added it in the 15th century.
Because I do assume in this period of Greece, really based on nothing but my own view of sort of what's logical, is that because the other tragedians rendered these same events, and these were like stories known to people, I almost assume people were walking around being like, oh, the second play in the Agamemnon saga. Like, this is Aeschylus. That they had some shorthand, but that they would not be particularly... I'm trying to think if there's a version of that in our world today where we could think, where someone might title something. It's like, oh, well, here's one thing you could think of. It's like with The Dark Knight or whatever. It's very normal for someone to say, like, did you see the new Batman?
Right. The new Batman.
And they'll know it's called The Dark Knight, but they may think of it as Batman in their own mind so much that the title doesn't register or have particular...
you seen the new Agamemnon? Like, yeah, because they know the characters, and now somebody's giving them a new treatment. Yeah.
But the other sort of suggestive and interesting thing is that one reason you might highlight the Libation Bearers is because they have an interesting relationship to justice that is sort of... might tell us something about what the play is really about. Because I think with Orestes and with Electra, it's easy to be sympathetic, right? Like, their father's dead, the sort of fate of their house has changed. They're very angry. But part of what Aeschylus is exploring is almost like the civic and political realms of justice, where, like, even if justice needs to be done to avenge a family, there are sort of like these weird people on the outside who will root for a certain event to take place as if they're interested in justice, but really they have sort of, I don't want to call it selfish, but a more human motivation. Because someone said, like, I think it was in one of the Michael Davies lectures, he was saying, you know, you can understand why the Libation Bearers as slaves from Troy, you can understand why they're angry to be slaves in the first place. But there's no particular reason that they should side with Agamemnon's legacy over Clytemnestra. In fact, Agamemnon is the one who's responsible for the war. Like, if not for Agamemnon, they could still be living in Troy as free people. So the idea that they would say, yes, take revenge on Clytemnestra is not necessarily intuitive, but they have some investment in, you know, chaos or this house breaking down. And so it's sort of an emphasis on, like, I think it highlights again that while you're pursuing justice, and even if the acts you take are justice, there's going to be all these other interested parties around benefiting or influencing, you know, who have motives their own and who have weird perspectives on what's going to happen and are sort of trying to guide events one way or the other.
Now I regret that this was one of the passages that I said, well, I'll leave that one out. I won't mark it, because I felt as I was reading and I was trying to figure out what was going on with different characters and rereading certain passages, I was thinking I'm not paying enough attention to the chorus in this one. It seems like the chorus is different than it was in Agamemnon and the chorus leader. And I just one of the things that I've found useful is to go through and read after having read the whole thing, read what one character says, just like skip to their dialogues, because one of the things we talked about before, often you have long, like half pages or sometimes a full page of just one character talking. It's not a lot of back and forth. And so you can get from one character what they're talking about, you can get sort of a lot of what's going on with them. And I didn't do that with the chorus, and I kind of felt the pull to do it, but I was just a triage, and I decided not to do that. But one of the things I did notice was that it does seem like the chorus is often, or the chorus leader or both, is often kind of egging them on. And we'll get to one of the key things is I think Orestes is not as excited about his murder as Clytemnestra was about hers, but we'll get to that. But yes, the chorus and the chorus leader are like egging them on a little bit. And then when they get to the palace, I think it must be the chorus leader says, like, well, I better hide before, like, when this goes down. So they're not the only instigators, obviously, but they're very much in favor of some chaos of Orestes going to kill these people. But then when it happens, they like take cover.
Right. And I think that's one reason why, I mean, again, I always worry about sort of projecting my modern sensibilities onto these things. But what you would sort of expect in terms of plotting is one member of the chorus to say something like if this were a modern play, I think what an editor would say is, oh, have some line that the chorus says like, oh, Clytemnestra is a cruel and unjust mistress. And so we accept that we're slaves, but she does things that are beyond the pale. So we need her to get out of the way because this is not just treatment or whatever. And I think the fact that sort of personal motivation doesn't exist, it says something, or I interpret it as it tells you something about the metaphysical role of the chorus. They are people and characters in the way, but it seems like in these tragedies they represent something supra-human. Not to mean they have special powers, but sort of above they represent something divine or a force in the world of influence. They're not just a character with a human perspective. They're and they're not the gods exactly either, but they are this aspect of nature. One way I think about it, almost I don't think this is exactly correct either, but one way to perhaps think about them is as the public or the crowd.
That's sort of
almost thinking, yeah, almost in another. It's sort of the crowd is baying for violence. Well, if you put it that way, we understand what that means. That political actors have ambivalence, but then if you said, oh, but the public really needs you to commit this murder, we would sort of know what that means. That there's some will or enthusiasm towards violence, coming from the public towards these actors in history and influencing them. And that's sort of a dynamic we all understand. I don't know if that's exactly what the chorus is supposed to represent, but that's sort of one comparison, I imagine.
Well, and putting them as sort of maybe divine or somehow in line with the gods or some suprahuman, as you put it. I noticed there's kind of a symmetry between the chorus and the Furies. The Arenias is how the Oxford translation has it. But that the Furies apparently really want this killing to happen, and so does the chorus. And we should, they're not, again, it's not as if the chorus is instigating it, but both these groups of women are in favor of, they want this thing to happen.
I think it's interesting, did we talk last week about, or last month I guess it was, Julian Jaynes and the bicameral mind and this whole theory that, because Julian Jaynes has this theory that he says modern consciousness and the connection of the two brains, the two spheres or hemispheres of your brain, we can tell it's modern because his interpretation of, I don't think he talked about Aeschylus specifically, but he definitely talked about the Odyssey, where his interpretation of ancient Greeks constantly talking about what the gods are telling them to do is that they literally interpreted part of their consciousness as divine voices and didn't understand that it was their own mind. So in other words, Odysseus would have a voice in his head that said, you have to get home to your wife or something. And he wouldn't understand that was the less developed hemisphere of his brain, and he would think it was a divine command appearing in his head. And that's interesting in reference to this play, because although Orestes does not describe it as there's this voice in my head, the voice of Apollo is very pertinent. One of the biggest pressures for him to kill Clytemnestra is Apollo has told him, if he doesn't, there's all these bad things that will happen to him. And what's interesting, again, tragedy is just so modern, because this is something David Foster Wallace would write or something. It's the gods tell him bad things will happen to you if you don't kill your mother. He kills his mother, and then bad things immediately happen to him. Well, some of the same bad things.
Some of the specifically predicted bad things. One of the things I didn't really understand, there's that passage about, the priest of Apollo told me that I have to do it because whatever, and my father is looking at me from underground and he's sending darts at me, and the Furies and whatever. And it says, if I don't do it, the Furies will come after me. And what happens at the conclusion of the play is he's done it and the Furies are coming after him. And, we'll get into Orestes maybe in his insanity or whatever that is at the end, and maybe it changes a little bit in the third play. But is that so? The thing that was supposed to be the punishment if he didn't do it, and then it happens when he does.
Right.
And I don't know if maybe the scholars have an explanation for that, or maybe it's because that he was just like so wrought by guilt and he'd spent so much time thinking about these. This is a modern psychological thing, but he'd been imagining the Furies. Oh no, the Furies are going to come and get me if I don't do it. And then when he does it, and he's very tense about this, and maybe we can get into that now. But then he finally does it, and he just like slips over the edge with his imaginings about the Furies. So maybe that's not supposed to be divine, but I don't know.
This is another very interesting point. One interpretation, I think, is that his ambivalence is what dooms him, because he's not really an instrument of justice, or to the extent that he is an instrument of justice, he's like a reluctant instrument of justice. And so you could say, but this actually manifests itself specifically in that I think Apollo's priest told him that he says something like, kill them in their own way, which, again, the Michael Davies from Sarah Lawrence, he was saying that kill them in their own way means kill them without saying anything. Just kill them silently. And that he does kill Aegisthus without any fanfare, but then he sort of has a brief confrontation with his mother. And Michael Davies was saying one way to interpret it is that he actually sort of failed to execute on the envisioned murder because his ambivalence led him to pause. And another way this ambivalence manifests that people really harp on is he calls his mother Clytemnestra throughout the play, and then right before he kills her, he calls her mother. And this is sort of supposed to symbolize, and again, I just have to harp, I know people will probably find this annoying, but like, I'm not saying that the style or the language or the values are modern. What's modern is like the view of psychology. Like, this is a presentation of like suppression or repression, right? He can't say mother because he knows what he's going to do, and so he's struggling to sort of think of her as occupying that position because it's painful. And then at the pivotal moment of sort of, maybe it's catharsis, I don't know, but he's able to, like, it's just sort of, it just feels like their understanding of human motivation and the complexity and ambivalence of human thought and human desire and action was like every bit as sophisticated as our own. And that's part of why it has this like eerily modern feel, is that they have the ability to, and you know, it should be said, there are exceptions to this, but that becomes not present, I think, for hundreds and thousands of years between Greek civilization and modern. There are exceptions to this, but there's a lot of, you know, literature from the Middle Ages or like early European civilization that is much more like, here's a righteous character being righteous, and he's happy that he's righteous, and God is also pleased with him. It does not have this like, life is impossible, and no matter what you friggin' do, like, even when you explicitly do what the gods ask, they might be mad, or just another god might show up and be just as mad as the first god was happy. Like, it's this, I don't know, it's just amazing. It's like perpetually startling to think, you know, people wearing sandals and carrying swords nevertheless had this this, like, I don't know, hipster attitude about life. Like, it's so cool.
Well, they might have had a better sense of it. Like we said before, it's like all the technology and the screens kind of gets in the way. If all you had to do, if you were like either a farmer, and then after you were done farming, is you sit around and you kind of observe people's behaviors and like the difficulties of how, like, that's basically what you have to think about, is your family and the people around you. That might help you to do that better. But then there's still the question of why wasn't that replicated so much in the Middle Ages? Why did this worldview or whatever it is exist in ancient Greece more? It was articulated more clearly or something.
Right, and it also could be, like, another thing I think I should say to be fair is that, like, I think there are also instances in which cultures have the sophistication we're talking about, but literature is not viewed as the venue for the expression, literature or theater? Is it like I think there are periods where civilizations had a very didactic view of certain arts, where they're like, no, the point of this is instructive. Like, you create a play so that young people know what their responsibilities are or whatever. And obviously that's very different than like art.
Yeah.
Or whatever, like, capturing
It's
the
not
complexity
exploratory in the same way.
Right. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that because depending on the time period, some of them read the Greeks too. So I don't want to run them down, just to emphasize that it's so striking how, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm sure everyone knows what I'm talking about. But yeah, it's really I was actually talking to a good friend of mine who's a painter, an artist, and we were just sort of talking about that eerie feeling of discovering things from the deep past that are, for whatever reason, sort of consonant with the current moment. And he was sending me, apparently there's sort of a list of famous paintings, especially from like the Renaissance and stuff, where either because of the style or what's pictured, if you saw them, you'd guess they were from like 1970. But they're actually from like 1560 or 1780 or something, and there's like this eeriness to seeing an image and being like, oh, what is that? Is that like a modern person mocking a Renaissance painting but making it modern? It's like, nope, that's a Renaissance painting.
I'm thinking that Hieronymus Bosch is probably what his name is pronounced, but he's a Renaissance
I think it's
artist.
Hieronymus Bosch.
Oh,
but
Bosch, yeah. That is very sort of surreal, weird, trippy stuff from like the 1500s, I think. But
one question I wanted to ask as well, sort of related to all this, is like, do you think, I remember when I was in school and we were talking about Greek gods, they sort of said, they were talking about the development of Greek gods, and they sort of would say something like, they thought that like the wind or a force like jealousy, they viewed this as like divine, but at first they sort of had like animist concepts, like, the wind is something divine. You might make a shrine to the wind, or like bring supplications, bear libations to the wind to get your but that at some point they personified these forces, and they had names to them. So instead of the wind, at some point you'd be saying the name.
You're saying Zephyrus, the god of that wind or whatever.
Yeah. And so I always wonder, at this period in Greek history, in this play we're reading, is it better to think, like, okay, talk about Apollo. Is it better to imagine that Orestes is thinking of, like, there's this very powerful person, not person obviously, but I'm thinking of how to think of a god, like a very powerful person who wants me to kill my mother? Or would the subjectivity of a Greek from that time be like, the forces of vengeance and filial piety are calling out for me? Is it an individuated being, or is it just what they call this universal force that they've identified as consistent in some way? Do you know the distinction I'm drawing?
Yeah, I think I know what you're saying. That might be my first impulse, is that might be a post-scientific revolution, like, well, the way we're going to now articulate these strong feelings we have is we're not going to talk about, this personification. We're going to talk about the social function of it, and we'll use it that way. I was thinking,
like, the distinction I'm drawing matters to us but wouldn't matter to them.
Well,
in other words,
they may not have thought about the distinction, but if you pin them down and we're like, do you really think that there's like a dude, like, really, do you think it's a guy and this guy who's doing whatever? They'd be like, oh, definitely, and he's gonna cause me problems if I do. And I'm not saying they would definitely say that, but I would lean a little bit in that direction. And one of the things that, I don't know, it seems relevant here. We were talking about Clytemnestra and Orestes and his sort of tension about killing her, and that dialogue. It's sort of brief, but I think I looked in it. I think it's the longest back and forth dialogue of these, like, one line at a time, like kind of real rapid fire dialogue. I think it's the longest one in this play, But yeah, he clearly hesitates, and she says, you've made up your mind to murder your mother, and he's like, I'm gonna avenge my father. Like even then, he's still talking. Like he's not just doing it. He's like sort of dragging it out. But even before that, he asks his friend. He says, Pylades. He says, "What do I do, Pylades? How can I kill my mother?" And he answers, "What then would become of Apollo's oracles declared at Pytho, and the oath you swore? Better that all men hate you than the gods." And Orestes answers, "I judge you winner. Your advice is sound." So like that's a very quick persuasion, but he invokes the gods. You've made promises. The gods are going to be mad, and he's maybe, I guess, at that moment he might just be thinking about, I don't know, because this is why the whole thing centers around this one guy killing his mother, and that's heavy. That is heavy. How could that ever be possible? Like and even if you have the nurse is the one who really like nursed him and took care of him when he was little. Still, even if your mother, she still birthed you and whatever, like how could you get yourself to do this? And it doesn't seem that Orestes is like power hungry. It seems like he's really torn. There's other stuff I'll look through and see what my notes were about this. There's other examples of how he's like really, it seems not necessarily that he doesn't want to do it, but also I did a kind of a count of the pages. The first 60% of the play is them like hanging out in a graveyard, essentially being kind of emo and talking about like, it's hard to tell. Are they explaining what they're going to do, or are they working themselves up? And there's a little bit of exposition where you have to understand that Orestes had been far away, and then he comes in the hair and all the whatever, but it feels like they hang out there kind of for a while. And I take that a little bit as that Orestes is trying to get himself going to go do this thing. And so I wonder if you just had the abstraction of like, well, it's for the public good, or, the family and what's right. And even then, and I guess maybe it depends on the person. Could you go and do this thing? Not the chorus leader is talking about it. Not Electra is going, oh, my older brother is going to save the day. But like, no, you've got the sword in your hand. Go make it happen. I don't know. I think you might need the fear of the gods in that context.
Right. No, and there's so much interesting, like, added evidence to the ambivalence that I didn't notice the first time reading through, but was able to sort of pick up on in the discussions of this I watched. Like, for instance, people pointed out that Electra wishes for two things: for her brother to return and for someone to avenge her father. But she does not initially imagine that those will be the same person. Like, she does not say Orestes should come back and avenge our father. She says, I hope Orestes comes back, and I hope like an agent of justice appears. But she's not connecting them. And then the scene you brought up where it's sort of being discussed, is the nurse Orestes' real mother, because she's the one who changed him. To me, it's a brilliant presentation of Cope, because it's almost like his psychology being like, well, is Clytemnestra even my mom? Like, almost it's like, well, maybe it'll be easy to kill her, because actually there's this other woman who took care of me. But like, then he's confronted with his mother, and it's like, nope. Like, regardless of who breastfed you, regardless of who changed your diapers, your mother is your mother.
Yeah.
And talking about how you are really close to a nurse is not actually going to make it easier to stab your mother.
Yeah.
Because like there's something, there's something very...
There's just a wall.
He's a very neurotic character, and that's like there's so many outside influences and thoughts bearing on his decision making, and it's interesting that even at sort of the final moment, he needs further reassurance from his friend. And people talked about, is it Pylades? Is that his?
Well, I thought it was Pylades, because I was like, it can't be Pilates, okay. So it's got to be. But I think it's Pylades is what people say.
Pylades.
Yeah.
But yeah, people were talking about what a strange character Pylades is, both in this and some of the other plays. I think just because of how few lines he has.
Well, I was going to say, it seems like his only function is to be there as like, no, you got to go. That's like almost the only thing he says. Yeah, and it's important, but it's one of like three things he says.
I think we've talked around it, but I wonder if we can get explicit, though. I don't know if I have a good answer to this. Why do you think... I guess I want to ask two questions. One, why is it important for this story that Orestes is so ambivalent? And why do the gods insist on vengeance being carried out? Like what are we sort of? I guess I'll take the second part first because I think maybe I have more coherent thoughts on that. But I guess it's like I see the gods as in part as like there are these implacable forces that are demanding certain values be like imposed on human life, and perhaps perhaps that's part of why this is hard for Orestes is like being an instrument of that, being an instrument of a value is not like natural to a human. You know, that's something a god would do, not what a human would do. We're ambivalent, we're complex. We might not want our life to be reduced to something like upholding justice. You know, that's difficult for a human being to do. But there's so much emphasis on, because another thing the scholar said is sort of that like part of the cultural attitude that's reflected in these plays is that no matter what the man is guilty of, it is like not acceptable to kill the male head of household and a king. And that is a crime, Clytemnestra's crime, that like calls out for response, regardless of what you think of Iphigenia's sacrifice. And that everyone would have understood, like, yes, Clytemnestra has to go down. Which in a way makes it doubly interesting that what we've been presented with here is Orestes having a hard time doing it.
Well, and that actually kind of fits into what we've been saying, because that would mean that they want to, if somebody wanted to make this point, which that kind of makes sense what you just said, that would be, I mean, you're basically talking about the possibility of anarchy. This is like a very important social thing. It's like you can't do regicide. Like that's just, it messes up too many things. It's like a hard rule, no regicide. And if you wanted to make that point, the way you could do it very emphatically is you could set up a plot in which it even involves somebody killing their mother. Even under those circumstances, you still have to set this one right. And so, yeah, that might be how Greek audiences would have interpreted this, as they would have nodded solemnly and been like, well, it's very difficult and he lost his mind, but that's what has to be done because whatever, you know.
Yeah.
Because otherwise the society falls apart.
I don't know if any actual scholar of this period would agree with me, but I think like the genius of the Greeks is partially like, or the genius of Aeschylus is, I think he's saying, because we talked earlier about how perhaps the reason the Furies are chasing him, and perhaps the reason bad things still happen to him, even though he did what Apollo wants, is precisely because of his ambivalence. Because he was supposed to go in there and just kill them silently and without sympathy, but he sort of broke and had a moment of further consideration and then did the deed. And so it's almost like this thing, and I certainly believe this about life, where it's like, what's being presented to us is like, it's noble and a sign of your complexity and a sign of your humanity if you are a reluctant warrior of carrying out some value end or some ideological end, but the world and the gods will not be charmed by your ambivalence. They will in fact punish your ambivalence, because what they want is willing human instruments. They want, you know, a happy warrior. And so we can, as fellow humans, admire this, the complexity of this psychology, that you love your mother, but you want justice to be done, and those two instincts are warring inside you, but that you will get no credit from the universe for being such a complex person.
Well, and that
you
might,
in fact, will be punished further.
That might add to the virtue of it, that like you're not getting any rewards for this, but you still, to be that way is still good. Yeah, and that does create a tension, because I haven't read the third play. I don't think you have either, but you've read more about how the three plays fit together. And if the third play involves somehow the establishment of courts to avoid this kind of stuff in the future, or at least points in that direction, then you have to wonder, if the gods are instigating these blood feuds, what does that say about them and justice? That like these courts have to be established in order to whatever, circumvent what the gods are telling people to do or what they ought to be doing. But I guess we'll have to see what's said there before we get into the details of that. But I sense that there might be some kind of tension. I don't know.
But I guess this will cut against what I just said, but I am not sure if to the audience at the time, Orestes' character, as presented in this play, would be interpreted as like, what a noble and complex human, or if they'd be like, this guy's neurotic.
Yeah,
Like
he's
you
weak.
don't yeah,
He's
like
putting
the
his
gods are
family
telling
relations
you
ahead
it's
of the stakes.
okay.
You know, why is he?
Culture, yeah, culture tells you it's okay. Why are you having such a hard time with this?
Yeah. Well, and it's very interesting. And as he feels himself start to slip. I think. Wait, let me just pull that one up because that's a very interesting passage. He says, Orestes says, "Still I grieve for what was done, for what was suffered, and for all our race, shouldering as I do a filthy and unenviable triumph." And then a little later he says, "But I'd have you know," and I didn't really look for this, but I don't notice a lot of stammering, a lot of like repeating words. But in the translation I had, it says, "But I'd have you know this. I cannot see how it will end. I'm like a charioteer driving his team far off course. My mind's unreignable. It bucks and pitches me away, and I am defeated. And fear near my heart is ready to sing and leap up to a raging tune." So he's saying this, but he's like, he can tell something's going on it's like about to kick off in his brain. "Before I lose hold of my senses, though, I openly declare to all my friends, not without justice did I kill my mother, stained as she was with murdering my father and with the hatred of the gods." And so, yeah, he has this burden of how I guess we'll see what happens, but he like, at least at the end of the play, he's kind of slipped off the edge, but he wants to say, I did this for justice and I view it that way. Whatever I say next or do next, that's my real position.
And again, that charge that Clytemnestra hates the gods, I assume that is sort of like a logical inference from her act of violence, that like someone who lived in accordance with the gods would
does
not...
she hate the gods, or is she hated by the gods?
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, is
was
that
with
what it
murdering
said?
my father and with the hatred of the gods. That's a little ambiguous, actually. Did I kill my mother, stained as she was with murdering my father and with the hatred of the gods? Could go either way, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, if you...
Yeah. I don't know why I interpret it like she
hates the
I think it's because I have like an anime view of Greek tragedy where, you know, this is Princess Mononoke. She's gonna storm heaven. But I love, like, I think if people are writing books or have a band, they should definitely look through this stuff for little phrases that they can, like, I'm immediately going to write down a filthy and unenviable triumph.
Well, that just like stood
the
out.
title
What
of
a
a book.
phrase. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's a good one. Filthy and unenviable triumph.
And
Well,
yeah, this is an interesting guy, because not everyone in this society would see it that way, right? Some people would say, this is a glorious triumph. I avenged my father. But he's, you know, uniquely...
Well, and I think there's still more to say
pricked by
about
it.
Orestes, but I see a door opening to start talking about Clytemnestra. And for me, this one, I don't know how you feel. If you have any initial thoughts about, like, did your view of Clytemnestra change reading this second play after reading the first one, or do you feel like you had kind of a similar view? I don't know, does anything spring to mind?
I think that in the first play, she is the most psychologically and intellectually adept character. Like, she's running circles around the other people in the play. And we sort of know that. And so we get to see her being a very effective manipulator. And so her presentation in this play is in some sense a reversal, because she's gone from the competent manipulator to someone now who is plagued by nightmares as a result of what she's done, and also is not... She knows that something like this might happen, but she's not expecting it in the exact moment. So we now see her on the back foot. And I guess I don't think my view really changed, though, because it doesn't... There's not enough of her perspective to, like... I do not feel like she's humanized in either play, really. There's not, like, a moment or a monologue that made me say, oh, I sort of get it now. Which is interesting, because certainly being mad about the sacrifice of your daughter is very relatable. Like I think ultimately her crime too, from our modern perspective, is fairly sympathetic. But she is presented in Agamemnon, I think, as almost like a scheming member of the court, just as much as a grieving mother. And so you don't necessarily, or I did not find myself sympathetic to her that much in the first play, and I think in this play, that part is the same, though she's been moved from sort of driving the action and being a step ahead of everyone else to now being a step behind. But I guess my view or interpretation of her character remains unchanged.
Yeah.
What about you?
Well, so we talked about this a little bit last time. I had left sort of an ambiguity open because I wasn't sure. Because if we're talking about these visceral things that are just like really difficult, like killing your mother or like losing a child, yeah, your husband sacrifices your daughter to get the ships to move. That's like another thing that I don't know, sort of unimaginable horror just kind of could really set somebody off in some direction. And when we talked before, I hadn't totally made up my mind about if she didn't really care about being queen. She was just so distraught, like you're saying, sort of grieving mother, and that she had this boyfriend, but that was kind of secondary. He was really maybe kind of a device or something, or it was an added benefit so that after she did this thing, then the people wouldn't come and murder her or something. I don't know what the concern might have been. But I wasn't sure whether she was political or whether she was scheming or not, because I still left a little bit of room for what you were talking about, and I just sort of suspended judgment about it. But in this one, I think you can't now. Once we've read the second play, I don't think you can really do that nearly as well, because she's now sent her son away. Her daughter is not. I mean, it's a little unclear. At first, I thought she was enslaved, but it seems like she's not enslaved. She's just like kept in her house so that she can't have an heir. Like she can't meet somebody and have an heir who's going to be from. I guess the idea is maybe Clytemnestra is going to have another. So
she existed under modern dating conditions.
Yeah.
At home alone, can't meet anybody.
Yeah, exactly. But so, there's, I mean, they're not all coming to my mind right now, but there's a number of things. Oh, the one that really stood out is, when you get into the actual killing, is Orestes shows up and he uses an accent. What is it? A Parnassian accent, whatever, some accent at the time. So he seems like a foreigner, and he like tricks Aegisthus and he like kills him. And then the slave, well, he just gets into his presence and kills him. And then a slave goes and warns Clytemnestra. Wait, I think I have that one. That's worth reading quickly. Before that, she greets. She doesn't know it's Orestes, but she like talks to him at the door and says, "Strangers, just say whatever it is you need, for we have all a house like this should have, warm baths and beds to charm away fatigue and the attention of judicious eyes. But if you two have come on graver business requiring more serious thought, well, that is the work men do, and we will let them know about it." So she's like, well, we're just women, and if you wanted to have a nice bath, we can help you with that. We'll put you up for the night or whatever. But I don't do serious things. And then like 2 pages later, after Orestes kills Aegisthus, and then the slave goes to warn her, the slave says, "I tell you, the dead are killing off the living." And she says, "Ah, me, a riddle. I can guess its meaning. We killed by treachery, and by treachery we are killed. Get me an axe to kill a man, quick." And so she's just like immediately is like not this like dainty woman anymore. She doesn't say, "Get me a sword." She's like, "Get me an axe." And it's just like light switch. And so I think that stuff like that, and I'll look at my other notes. Maybe there was another thing, but Clytemnestra, maybe she was like ticked off by this sacrifice of Iphigenia, or not ticked off, like made slightly angry, but like she was set off by it. But she has other stuff going on, and she's herself, I think, a Spartan princess.
No, I think another brilliant thing you're now making me realize. Okay, so this is something about motives, because the first play is like, okay, imagine that a woman has a really good reason to kill her husband, but actually maybe she's just a scheming, ambitious person, but she has like great cover. And then in this play, it's almost a complete reversal, where it's like, no, Orestes is sort of so noble, he doesn't even want, he's sort of the inversion of, it's like Clytemnestra wants to do the murder because she's bad, but on the face of it, she has a good reason. And it's like Orestes also has a good reason, but he doesn't want to because of these noble, or maybe you might say weak qualities. And I think part of what we see is, I don't think it's saying something so simple as motives don't matter, only what you do matters, but it is sort of saying like the world and the gods react to these actions, and like your internal motives, that's almost like a human story that we will take interest in, but like the world sort of turns on the events. And this drama you have in your own mind, that like that'll be interesting for your own edification, but that's not, you know.
Yeah, that's sort of for you. Yeah, and I want to kind of zero in on that. That you said that there's two killings, and they both have a reason for it, but one of them is leaning into it, and the other one is leaning away from it. They're sort of, and maybe that doesn't really matter. Maybe that's the second part of what you're saying, is like that's however you feel about it. This stuff turns. Like this is how the world moves, and this is what other people
Right, like one justified revenge murder that the person is happy to have an opportunity to do because they have other ulterior motives. Another arguably justified revenge murder that the person is reluctant to do because of how sort of dark and difficult it is to kill one's own mother. And it's almost like the fact that those motives are like entirely opposite does not allow either character to escape their fate. Like in the end of the day, the fact that what they bring to the murders is so different. It's like they're still just sort of buffeted about by what the gods or the Furies or other forces need to happen.
It's inexorable. Like, what's going to happen is going to happen. You can have whatever opinions about it you want to have.
Yeah, Orestes' nobility and ambivalence cannot save him, and Clytemnestra's ambition and cleverness cannot save her.
Yeah.
Oh, and very Greek now, we have a cat.
I didn't even notice.
Cameo.
Domino, you come to say hi? And let's see if he might come back up on the table. We'll see. Yeah. He's been sitting with me recently.
Maybe he likes Greek tragedy.
Yeah. What do you think, Domino?
Did you have any thoughts? I was sort of, I get like weird visceral reactions to certain visual things, and there's this metaphor in this where Clytemnestra, I think her nightmare is that she's like suckling like a serpent, and sort of like her milk and the blood of the serpent biting her mixes, and they talk about blood clots. That was the part that was it's like the clotted blood and the milk coming together, and that was the part. And then there's like this sort of metaphor reversal where she's like, oh, the serpent is Agamemnon taking his revenge, and then Orestes is like, no, I'm the serpent, like the baby that you weaned, although maybe the nurse weaned him, I don't know.
Yeah.
That now has come to bite you or whatever. But like, did you have thoughts on that metaphor or that reversal or?
Well, when I first read that, I kind of went, is he here? Like, what is he going to think about this? Is Orestes going to be like, oh no, why is my mom dreaming that I'm a snake? Am I on the wrong side of this? Am I not doing the right thing? Because that seems like it's a little bit in there already up to that point. But no, he says like, no, I'm the snake. And he doesn't, at least in the translation I read, it doesn't seem like there's any, seems like he likes it, which that's a sort of a modern.
Yes, well, people say, contra Genesis, people say that in many ancient cultures, snakes did not have the negative associations that we do, and this is why.
That might be an Abrahamic thing. This might be a Garden of Eden.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's totally ridiculous. Let me be a universalist for a moment here. Snakes slither in the grass and have poison. They're horrifying. There is no human culture that would not find them horrifying. Like, the reason she's having a nightmare about it is because they're horrifying. It's because they're horrifying.
It's not. I had a great dream where I gave birth to a snake. It was amazing. Well, no, and then you can. It's older than Christianity because this is. I mean, I don't know what people really think about these kinds of theories, but I've read a thing where dragons exist in lots of different cultures, or their image exists because they were a very early predator to people, to humans, because they were like a combination of a bird of prey and a snake. And so they're very, maybe not a predator to humans, but they're an animal that creates problems for humans. And so that also kind of, well, it harms that theory, because this is an example of snakes being dangerous, much older than Christianity.
Yeah, see, I think obviously what happened is that the serpent is actually a dragon, and after talking Eve into trying the apple, God took away their wings.
Well, there you go.
But this is y'all ain't ready for that conversation, as they say. But no, yeah, it's because I guess the reason people say, I guess in both Egypt and ancient Greece, probably from the influence of one or another, the snake symbol was, and I guess the Ouroboros was associated with medicine.
The snake biting its own tail, yeah.
Yeah, so people have this idea of like it couldn't have been a purely negative connotation if it was associated with medicine. But I don't know if I buy that either, because it could just be like you derive medicines from venom, or there could be like a different association. I don't know exactly.
But in this context, I think the knockout thing is that this was a nightmare, and after she had this bad dream, it was the reason why she sent the libation. Did I understand this correctly? I think the libation that Electra brought to the grave was sent by Clytemnestra. Do you think that that's what that was? Yeah.
Yes.
Because at first I didn't.
She thinks Agamemnon's spirit is like acting up, and that's why she's having the nightmare. And so she's.
I missed it the first time, and because I thought it was just Electra going to the grave with a libation. But then the second time I read it, I sort of picked up on that. And I wasn't sure if I read it correctly. But yeah, so
okay, here's another quote.
Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, in these, I think I have a problem. These plays are very short, and it's a piece of great world historical literature. And so I have this instinct, pretentious lit cell that I am, to say everything is significant, right? You wouldn't do a scene just because it's cute. It has to be like layered with meaning. So one of the scenes that like, it's so sort of strange and striking that I know he was trying to say something, but I don't know what he was trying to say, is what's the point of the scene with the hair? Like, Orestes leaves his hair, and then he has a conversation with Electra about, like, whether or not the hair proves that he's her brother. And, like, it sort of just seems like a cute scene of, like, oh, this is just, he put it in so that Orestes can make some sort of argument, like, no, it is truly I, your brother. But I wasn't sure if I was missing something symbolic or something. Well, I guess it invokes blood and genetics, which is obviously like the theme.
The translation I read, I thought it was a few things. I mean, one is he like travels from far away, presumably kind of in a stealthy way. He doesn't have something else to put on the grave. And you weren't really asking about this, but we can talk about it. But so he doesn't have a liquid to pour on the grave, but he has something to give. And so he gives of his own hair. And cause he's traveling and he's not totally relaxed. And so he's doing this, paying this respect to his father's grave. But then also, I think the tension of she's talking to the chorus, and then she sees it and she says, wait, whose hair is that? Who would put hair? And then she says, it looks like mine. And then, so that's from her family. But then there's the tension of, if it looks like hers, it's either her mother's or her brother's. And she really doesn't want it to be her mother's, because she doesn't want to think about her mother, obviously. And she would really love for it to be her brother's, but she's not sure that it is. And then he comes out but she then sees his footprints, and she thinks it's his footprint. And then he comes out, and this was another thing, I guess this is one of the reasons why it seems that several years have passed, at first I said, why doesn't she recognize him? It's her brother. And I was just like, we just read the other play. I thought this happened like immediately after. But I think that some number of years have passed so that she doesn't immediately recognize him. Yes. And he says, you recognize my hair and you recognize my footprint. And then he has some kind of needlework thing, something that she sewed or something. And he shows it to her and says, look, you made this for me. And then she believes it. And that, I mean, for me, it's the genetics and the blood and the family thing, that the whole thing is about family, right? The whole trilogy is about this sort of family dispute. So I just kind of connected it to that, but I didn't look for more.
Yeah, it just seemed conspicuous to me, and it's evocative, like locks of hair on a grave. But maybe that's the power of it too. It's just sort of visually.
Yeah. Well, and that sort of leads into Electra. We haven't talked about Electra very much. I wrote a note. I wanted to ask you, and maybe this is a little bit strong because I thought about it a little bit afterwards, but I said, what is the point of Electra? Because like I don't know. I couldn't. I almost went like, do you even need this character? And I now have. I think I have more thoughts about what she's for, and why she's necessary. But she's. I don't know. She's. If you look at it, she seems like the earliest character that you could cut and not lose things that are really structural to the story. Not that
Well,
you can cut
say,
anyway.
because I have something I have gleaned from the lectures I watched, but I don't want to prejudice your take. So tell me why you think Electra is necessary, and then I'll tell you what I.
Well, so for me, one of the things that's very noticeable about her is she comes in and like the first thing she asks is she says, "What?" She's asked her the chorus, "What do I say? Should I give the normal prayer for over this libation? Should I give the normal prayer? Should I say it comes from my mother? I don't want to say that. Should I just pour it out and walk away as if I were dumping filth, without saying anything?"
Yeah, so she's neurotic like her brother.
Yeah, and
Analysis paralysis.
she's also torn up because her mom murdered her dad, which and she's well,
Sure.
she says at one point, "I'm a child untutored," and so I was like, how old is she? So she has to be at least 10 because Agamemnon went away and came back so she's at least 11 probably, and then if a few more years pass, maybe she's like 15. So she's kind of a teenager, and maybe her mom murdered her dad when she was like 12. So yeah, she might be a little bit neurotic too. But so she asked this question. And then one of the things that also happens in that dialogue is she kind of wants to pray for something bad, or that maybe the chorus, I can't remember, they encourage her to pray for something bad for her father's killers or something. And she like hesitates and she says, "Should I pray for something bad? I don't know if that's a good thing to do in a prayer, to pray for a bad thing." And then she eventually does. And then by later in the story, she she prays that someone soon appear and avenge you, Father, killing the killers. And then later she says, "When will Zeus, all flourishing, bring his hand against them and at last cut off their heads? Now let a pledge be given to this land. I demand justice from the unjust. Hear me, earth and the dark lords underground." So she goes from being sort of, I don't know, like a debutante to she also like kicks into a high gear. She gets pretty fired up about it.
She goes Clytemnestra mode.
She goes Clytemnestra, right? And so I kind of, well, not the only thing, but something that stood out to me is this seems like a little bit, and maybe this is a modern interpretation, this sort of a cliche, but if there's anything about a loss of innocence in this play, it seems like it might be in Electra, is that you have like this young girl who at first she's like she's indecisive about what she should even say over the libation. And then she's like, "Oh yeah, we definitely have to go, Orestes, you should go kill our mom." And I had noticed the thing that you pointed out, that she wasn't putting those two things together, that it's going to be the same person who that he comes home and he does it. But yeah, she's on board before too long, and she starts out not there. So that's how I go, okay, that is a worthwhile character.
So there's two, I'm going to state them more dramatically than they were stated in the things I watched and read, but they're both interesting. And I think I agree with the first one more. Because one question that several scholars ask that they say you have to ask about this play is, so at the beginning, Electra and Orestes are reunited. The most logical thing, Electra still lives at home, knows her mother. The most logical thing would be for Electra to be the instrument that brings Orestes into the house, that gives him cover so that he can kill Aegisthus and their mother. But that's not what happens. Electra leaves, and then these slaves, these libation bearers, are the instrument of getting him where he needs to be, or passing along the message. And it says, so why would you have a potential major character, someone who has a good reason to be involved in the plot, like a justification? They sort of exit, and these random strangers, the chorus, they play this significant role. And what I took them to be intimating again is this is something about when you're trying to carry out a justice that is personal and familial, society and the public and like the ends of these other forces are weighing in. So like, in other words, like, it's almost like the civic intruding on the familial. Like this should be a story that begins and ends with members of the family, but no, for some reason the crowd is insinuating itself and playing a role. And again, getting to the courts in the third play, it's almost this thing of like, how do we play out these issues of justice within a family when we also exist in like a broader society now, and there are different groups of people that may. So it's almost like they had a certain attitude in describing this, that Aeschylus was like subverting expectations by having Electra leave, and then the chorus play this role, because the most natural thing you would do is have Electra return to the palace and say, "Oh, there's a stranger you should meet."
Well, and the thing is, he even sends her. I think he says, "You go to the palace and tell us if anything." He like kind of sends her in as a lookout, right? But she leaves the story and she doesn't come back in. So he does send her in. But yeah, you're right. She's not the pivotal. She's not even as important as the nurse.
Right. And I think there's another. Speaking of going Clytemnestra mode, there's another interpretation, which I think is less in the text, but is interesting enough to bring up, which is that Electra has the same sort of political instincts as her mother, and sort of knows, even if this is just, the best move for me is not to be directly implicated.
Is to get out of the way.
Like, this thing I want to happen is going to happen, but maybe Orestes gets tracked down and killed, maybe someone else comes to power, but if I can be totally separate from the events, maybe they say, well, there's one member of the dynasty who doesn't have blood on their hands. It's in other words, it could be good for her to look like a neutral party. You really have to sort of extrapolate from the absence to believe that, but I think it's an interesting idea, given that, she's Clytemnestra's daughter. And
well, yeah, and you could look and see if it lines up, and it might still apply even if you included this one. I think that in the text, in the translation I read, it does have a line where Orestes is like directing her. He says like, "You go and do this," and she kind of goes and does that, meaning like just go into the palace and hang out. And even if that were in there, you could still say, well, she accepts that role for all the reasons you just talked about. But yeah, that's verging maybe on overreading more than some other stuff that we've talked about. But yeah, that could be in there. I think that's reasonable. When it ends with certainly the oldest cliffhanger I've ever seen, it must be one of the oldest ever recorded. So Orestes has run away because he's now haunted by these Gorgons or the Erinyes or the Furies or whatever they are. He's seeing these terrible women who are described in a very spooky way. And then the chorus says, "Again, for the third time on the royal house, the storm has crashed, its curses blowing through the blood and run its course. First came the feast of children's flesh, Thyestes' anguish. Next came the grim fate of the man, the king, the warlord of the Achaeans, killed in the bath. Now once again, for the third time, from somewhere comes a savior, or should I say, a death. Where will it end? When will it all be lulled back to sleep and cease? The bloody hatred, the destruction." And that's how the play ends. So they're sort of winding up the three things that have happened so far, and we're going to see what happens next. But the part of that stood out to me is it says, "Once again, for the third time, from somewhere comes a savior, or should I say a death." And I wasn't sure about the saviors in all those contexts, or what that means. In this case, in the third,
I think it makes sense because, again, it can be hard to model this sort of Greek subjectivity of believing all these things at the same time. It's like, but I interpret that as like Agamemnon is a savior because the whole society needs the ships to move. And so him killing his daughter saves the war effort. But then, I guess the one I have the hardest time with is Clytemnestra, because it's like, who is she a savior for? I guess those wronged by Agamemnon, but
and she doesn't save Iphigenia, but maybe she's righting some wrong. I guess that's a spot where it might be useful to know exactly what the Greek word that they translated as savior was, because it might be like corrector of injustice or something. It's a little bit, has a different nuance than savior. But I even understand Clytemnestra a little bit more than I understand. The first thing in that list is Atreus, feeding Thyestes' sons to him without him knowing. So like, how is that saving anything? That's like the weirdest one. And so I don't know.
It's also just funny, like their meta knowledge of these dynamics, like because everyone you read will be like, oh yeah, justice is really important in Greek society. Like the need for vengeance would have made sense to everyone. But it's so funny that they just have this line. It's like we don't know when this shit's gonna end. Like this is sort of problematic. Like even if we really believe in it, like this value that we want to uphold can really also bring everything down. Or it has no limiting principle. You can have bloodletting forever. Like in that line, you sort of get the suggestion, and this is almost like a Christian idea, that like the real savior is the person who can take it on the chin, who can say like, you deeply wronged me, but I'm moving on, like no more. It hints at that.
Yeah. A savior.
Like it's asking, how could someone come into the world with the strength or the discipline to like end the cycle of violence?
Yeah, that's a good point.
And Christ has an answer, audience, but
I was going to say, when will it all be lulled back into sleep and cease the bloody hatred, the destruction? Well, maybe when the king comes, maybe that's what they were talking about. No, clearly not.
Or maybe when gods stop insisting.
Yeah.
When these pagan demons stop goading their human subjects into killing each other.
Maybe then it'll stop. Yeah, right.
I didn't pick up on this reading the text, but several of the folks I watched lecturing about it afterwards said that at the end, only Orestes sees the Furies. And I wondered what we were supposed to take from that. Like, in other words, I didn't know, like, is it normal that if a god's interacting with a human in Greek times, or if it's something divine is interacting with a human, is it normal that only they would experience perception? Or is that supposed to make us think maybe Orestes really just is nuts? That, like, not something real is happening, but that he's consumed with guilt. And again, it gets back to my much earlier question of, like, to the Greeks, is there even a meaningful difference between experiencing guilt and being tortured by the Furies? Or are those just synonymous phrases?
That's a very good and important point, and I hadn't thought of that. I had assumed that because at the end of this play, the chorus, or whoever it is it's the chorus, I think, can't see the demons, the Furies, that it somehow, that was just going on in his own head. But you're right. I'm not sure if the assumption then was that when the gods are communicating with somebody, only that person sees them, or it's often the case that, or there aren't really clear rules about it. But that changes it a lot, because I haven't read the third one, but I think one of the professors that you had sent mentioned something like that in the third one, other people can also see them. In the third play, other people can also.
I think it's almost like Apollo and the Furies are like opposing lawyers at the court. Like that's how it's been described when they're discussing.
Yeah. Well, I guess
it becomes what's the big law show? Why can't I think of the name that everybody loves? Law and Order is what I was thinking. It becomes like a Law and Order procedural. Yeah. Law and Order 485 BC or 450.
Apollo and the Irenaeus and the Furies. That'll be interesting. But I had always assumed that this thing going on at the end was just his mind slipping. It wasn't the gods actually intervening or the Furies actually doing something. But yeah, I guess that's not necessarily true, and we'll have to see how it fits in with what goes on in the third play.
Yeah, there's just so much this subtle, sneaky stuff. Because, like, again, in Islam, I guess the Old Testament is more complicated, but, like, in Islam and Christianity, depictions of the ancient world, it's just like there's a group of people, and then, like, an angel comes, and they all see it. It's like the divine is interacting with humanity straightforwardly. But the Greeks do have this sneaky stuff where it's like someone will get lost, and then, like, a god appears to them, but they go back to their compatriots, and the gods are like, did you really see, Apollo or whatever? And it's like, were you guys sort of, like, cheekily religious? Like, you already had
there was already a little bit of debate about this.
That, like, maybe the people in your society who are having the most visceral relationships with the gods are just insane, and, like, you've sort of moved on to, like, a more... Because there are scholars, right, that I think I engaged with this in college, that there were some people that were like, oh no, by late antiquity, the Greeks were like atheists and just used gods as like linguistic tools to, again, describe forces in the world.
Well, I'm also interested in that thing you've pointed out a couple of times now, and I'm sort of enjoying thinking about it, the teasing out. Was it distinct for them? The most recent one was like about being hounded by the Furies and feeling guilt. Like we put those in very, not totally separate categories, but they're at least discrete categories. We say somebody could be experiencing one without the other. And if you could have a person from the 5th century BC here in front of you, and you tried to ask them which one they meant, they wouldn't even quite understand what you were asking. Like they would just have those things like totally combined, whereas we've been able to separate them because of our own. I mean, maybe we have our own sort of linguistic tools where we talk about societal needs or whatever.
Yeah, and some of these things, like
Right.
you do wonder, like, were they literal or were they just conceptual tools? Because I will say, even as a modern person, like, I encourage everyone, sometimes you have to, like, get in an antiquated mindset where, like, I think if you're, like, I don't know how I want to express this exactly, but it's almost like if you're depressed or anxious or something and you can't put a finger on it, on why your humors are out of balance. I do think it can be like fruitful to be like, well, is there something I did that some like value or force in the universe is upset about that I can like placate? It's the example I'm thinking of is like, oh, was I impatient with my mother? And sort of like the spirits of filial piety are now attached to me, like making my life miserable. And when I go, if I make an apology or if I do something nice for my mom, they will release me and go bother someone else. And like, again, there's no sense in which I think that is happening, really. I don't think spirits are attached. But like, conceiving of it that way can lead you to action in a way that if you just think like, oh, my neurochemicals are out of balance, it's like, well, what are you supposed to do with that? Like, I guess you can take a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, but you don't know what to do in
terms of your action. Well, and it's convenient that the serotonin reuptake inhibitor also costs money and you can buy it from a person, and so there's a lot of encouragement to like use that route, right? But yeah, that even the sort of false or at least unverified template that you might put on about whatever spirits of this or that thing, that guides you to some useful behavior in a way that the more verifiable thing doesn't get you to the behavior.
Yes, sometimes anthropomorphizing everything is so helpful or can lead to productive action in a way that like a scientific view of the world isn't as intuitive for me in telling you what to do, that sometimes I almost wonder if that's what ancient peoples were doing. Like, that they didn't believe in this stuff literally either, but were just sort of like, this is a really useful way to conceive of your problems because it will lead you to take corrective action.
Well, and
obviously, I don't know.
Yeah, not to go all evolutionary psychology, but it's obvious that people have been interacting with other people for a very long time. And so to put problems or whatever into the form of some sort of humanoid something, and imagine it that way as something, that can be placated or angered, it's been more easy for people to understand for much longer. So it's easy to see how that would emerge as kind of an explanation system. But I guess we can leave it there for now. Farewell until next time. Take care and happy reading.